Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's September 27, 2021, and today we are discussing reform and education in pre-coup and maybe post-coup Myanmar with Marie Lau, author of the recent book Myanmar's Education Reforms, A Pathway to Social Justice? Published in 2020 by UCL Press, which is open access and can be downloaded for free from their website. Hello, Marie.
Hello, Luke. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I would say your book is a very helpful overview of education reform in Myanmar, framed by larger tensions like neoliberalism and social justice, and mostly focusing on the policy window of the NLD administration, which, as we now know, led us to a military coup. So your book may be something of an elegy, but we can get to that. While civil-military relations come into it, that's not the focus per se of your book. How would you, in your own words, describe your book to foreign students and researchers of and in Myanmar, and whoever else? Who else do you want to read it?
I think the book is actually meant for anyone who's interested in Myanmar, contemporary Myanmar, and specifically what happened between 2010 and 2020. So it's more than just the window of the NLD, but it goes to the early 2000s to sort of explain how the reforms started, how they were made possible. And to a certain degree, it's a sequence to my first book, which was very specifically on the whole country and how reforms were envisaged by the various factions trying to change Myanmar. And that book was looking not only at education, but at pretty much everything. I was looking at the peace process, I was looking at education, I was looking at economic reform. That was published in 2016. But this is very specifically looking at one sector, because education permeates right through so agricultural reforms will be relevant for a particular sector of society. Economic reforms will be, again, relevant for a particular sector of society. Education is relevant for everyone. It's a little bit like health, but with health, you have to be ill. And education is something which obviously all families engage with. And it was a bit of an afterthought in President Thein Sein's vision of a new Myanmar. But he started off by saying we'll have national reconciliation, we'll have a peace process, we'll have economic reforms. And then he said, and we'll have education reforms as well. That sort of came in a slightly later speech. But it's been absolutely key in terms of how Myanmar operated between 2010 and 2020. It was key in how we got to 2010. And I would argue it will still be key post-2021 coup once the dust has settled. We're not there yet at this particular point in time, but parents will continue to demand change, even of a military regime, simply because they've in part tasted a better quality system. They've seen things change. Teachers have had a better approach to teaching, have had access to different materials, academics as well. So in many ways, you can turn back the clock in certain respects, but you can't turn it back entirely. So education will remain relevant. It is, however, more of a history book now than it was meant to be. It was meant to be sort of an assessment of 10 years and then seeing how the reforms were going to go forward. It's now more of a, what happened in those 10 years with a final full stop with the coup, which happened in February 2021. But in that, it's also a good baseline for what happens next.
Yes, and speaking of history, most people who know something of Myanmar would not quibble with the statement Myanmar's education system needs reform. But why is that, and how did we get to this situation? So I'd like to begin by talking about someone else's research that you bring up. So apparently there was a dissertation in 1920 by someone named U Gaon, and he wrote a history of Myanmar's traditional education and reform. What did Myanmar's education look like before 1920?
So Myanmar was very different from the other countries in British India in that sense, in that it had a monastic education system. So, for example, I work on India and Pakistan as well, and there was no equivalent of a local education system in that part. Whereas when the British arrived in Burma and annexed it, so to speak, to to British India, they found that there was actually also already a very wide local system in place, a system that they denigrated in many ways by saying that it didn't prepare people for modernity, modern life, and so on and so forth, because it obviously didn't teach anyone English and it was seeped in the Buddhist tradition. But it meant that actually Burma as a country was far more literate than any of the other areas of British India. The interesting thing is that obviously this was very gendered, and a lot of this education, although not entirely reserved for boys, was mostly for boys. There were schools for girls as well, but that the dissertation that you just mentioned actually explains that girls were at a large disadvantage. The other interesting thing is that we also have the rise of the national schools. I mean, in that period where the idea of Burma nationalism was cultivated, but in a very Burmese way, again, because people couldn't really agree on things and what should be taught and what views one should have about nationalism and who should be thinking what, the national schools actually fell apart and did not continue into the post-independence era. Actually, they fell apart before independence, which is actually quite interesting. And what is also very interesting, because I'm not a historian, so this was not an idea of giving, it was a historical overview rather than anything else. What's really interesting is that once we get into the independence era, monastic schools become less important. There is actually this movement, which you have actually in all post-colonial countries, where the state decides to put in place a government education system. And obviously at the beginning, you also have some private players around, some religious players, including Christian missionaries and schools, which they run. But of 1962, with the coup and Ne Win and the Burmese way to socialism, we in the end up with a very monolithic state education system, with everything else nationalized and everything having to conform to what is the idea of Burmanization. So everything in Burmese, everything with regard to teaching the sort of national identity, the Burma national identity. So we move in a period of less than 50 years from importance of monastic schools, national schools which don't really make it, to a state education system that then becomes the backbone of the socialist system. I mean, that in sort of 3 sentences is the history of 50 years of which goes until 1988. Literally.
Right. And it's kind of a truism that the regime after 62 were economic mismanagers and they drove the economy of Burma, Myanmar into the ground. But was the decline of the education system connected to this economic decline, or did the regime at that time make explicit policy decisions that caused the deterioration of the education system up to 88? Because in 1962, it was, especially higher education was esteemed in Myanmar compared to other places.
It's a difficult question to answer because these things are interconnected. So in cutting the country off from the rest of the region and the rest of the world, the Burmese way to socialism didn't actually allow for any kind of exchange of ideas. This is particularly important for higher education, probably slightly less important for school education. But in driving the economy into the ground, which is undisputedly the case, you also then don't have the kind of money that you need in order to pay your teachers well, in order to build up your schools, renovate your roofs and your toilets and the general infrastructure, make sure that the books are of high quality. All of these things can only be paid if your economy is doing relatively well and if there is enough money, if the state actually has enough money to do that. And I remember on one of my first trips to Myanmar in 2000, the visible poverty of teachers was extraordinary. What that must have been even worse in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I can just imagine how difficult it must have been. In many ways, teachers I've spoken to, older colleagues and older teachers who have all said it was a vocation. It's something we dedicated our lives to our country, to the children, to making sure that they became educated. A lot of those older teachers, also academics, teachers at university, will have had the chance to study abroad. But then there was this entire generation, my age and slightly older, who never had the chance to go abroad because 88 happened, and that's when they were at university. And beyond that, there was never a chance to actually go and engage with ideas outside. So these things are interlinked in many ways. But it didn't mean that when the economy was, I wouldn't say open, because it was really opened only towards ASEAN and China, sort of post 1990, when SLORC and then SPDC, renamed SPDC, took over. At that particular point in time, the economy improved, but none of that money went into education. So people could argue and say, well, it's not only to do with the economy. Of course not. It goes beyond that. Education only started to become a concern to those who governed Myanmar post 2010. Prior to that, there was obviously a big demand from parents, especially sort of post 2005, 2006, and that's why we suddenly have the mushrooming of a shadow private sector, which comes up at first. I mean, and I describe it very briefly in this book, but more detail in my previous book about how private schools were not allowed to operate. So officially they were teaching computer science and they were teaching English. And under English, they were teaching social sciences and other things. And under computer science, they were teaching mathematics and science. So that actually you were able to send your child to these supplementary schools or these after-school schools and make sure that they actually had a much broader education than what was on offer from the Myanmar government. But if you look at what the reforms that happened post 2015, which are based on a prep towards this reform, so 2010 to 2015, we have the Comprehensive Education Sector Review, and we have an actual plan put in place, which then results in being the National Education Sector Plan. And the plan is based on the recognition of the problems of the sector. And so in 2015, when the NALD takes over, all of that's ready to go. And the development partners are ready to put in money. And everything is tackled at once, which wasn't a great idea. But it means that there's a recognition. We need to change teacher training. We need to change the curriculum. We need to change the way that universities admit students. We need to change how universities teach and how research can feed into teaching. So the entire sector from preschool right up to PhD is reformed. And the early indications from parents was that they were very happy that things were moving in the right direction. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything worked immediately, but change was visible to teachers, to parents, to students.
And when people hear the word reform in the context of Myanmar, they probably quickly go to political reform and they assume they know what that means. Oh, it means democratization and this kind of thing. But what about reform in the education sector? What do you mean by this word? How do you evaluate these reforms? Reform towards what? And were there competing impulses maybe between international organizations, between different political actors in Myanmar about where this reform should be going?
So first of all, I'd like to say that democratization or democracy was never on offer. I know that that's a fantasy that a lot of people dabble in, but if you look at all the documentation that led up to 2010, the first elections, and then between 2010 and 2015, be it the constitution, be it the entire movement towards change, what was on offer was a participatory system where the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, would retain some level of political control and power by 25% of all the seats in all parliaments, and also key to, controlling 3 key ministries. In this participatory system, it meant that it was no longer just 2 or 3 or 1 general taking decisions. Voices from all parts of the country and all political spectrums could be heard and contribute, but the final decision could be taken by the Tatmadaw if they so wanted. And what the interesting thing for me was always, I'll get to your question in a minute, but the interesting thing for me always was the fact that the Tatmadaw was not interested in service delivery. So they were very happy for the civilian government to take care of the quote unquote reforms and civilian delivery of health, education, agricultural reform, and so on and so forth, but keeping control that over the quote unquote moves towards trying to edge them out, the democratization process, whatever you want to call it. The actual offer was not democracy. It was participation from different sectors of society. But reforms, as you said earlier on in one of your questions, was deemed necessary by all, including President Thein Sein, who was a ex-military general. So what does reform really mean? It means different things to different people. The development partners, which are the international aid agencies, from World Bank, IMF, to country national aid agencies like USAID, or what is now, used to be DFID, the UK equivalent of USAID, or JICA was been part of that, or the UN organizations like UNICEF. They all work towards reforms that are broadly similar across the developing world. So lessons learned in Latin America or in Africa or in other countries in Southeast Asia are then applied elsewhere. And there is a great academic body on this showing that actually that very rarely works, because you can't just apply lessons learned in one country on another country without taking the context into account and without understanding what the local needs are. And Myanmar was slightly different in that sense, and that's why the CESR was so important. So the first 5 years, so between 4 years, because it was 2011 by the time all of this got started, 2011, 2012 even, till 2015, the development partners were invited by President Thein Sein and his government to support the reform process, starting with an analysis of where we are. Where is Myanmar today? What is the need in health, in education, in the economy, in agriculture? And basically we end up with, in education, with a sector review. And I know that there were a lot of civil society groups, including Myanmar civil society groups and ethnic, so Burma and ethnic civil society groups, saying, oh, this is a waste of time, and we all know that the education system is broken, we just need to reform it. Actually, it wasn't a waste of time at all, because in order to be able to adapt the reforms and make any change meet local needs, you need to first identify the need. It's not enough to know that a system is broken or not functioning well. You need to actually know how to change it. And to a certain degree, the CESR did that very, very well. What the problem was with what was then put on offer was that, I think I mentioned just earlier, everything was reformed immediately at the same time, because all the development partners have carved up the sector. So Australia was sort of seen as a lead agency. Britain became very interested in higher education. The EU spent a lot of money on ethnic education, but also sometimes schooling. JICA was in charge of the curriculum review. So different aid agencies focused on different sectors without really coordinating with each other who was doing what with whom. And at the heart of all of this is this poor Ministry of Education sitting in Naypyidaw. It's understaffed. It's never done anything but command and control before. And suddenly it's dealing with all these different aid agencies having to follow the leads of different national priorities. And that's also why, although the CESR was a very good baseline document, documenting exactly what needed to be done, trying to do everything across the entire sector at the same time then made it very difficult for the ministry to be able to show progress in all sectors and be successful. So the midline of the NESP, which is the planning document, showed that yes, things had changed, but nowhere near the level that was required after 2.5 years, and that's because everyone was so thinly stretched. The development partners also came in with very, very particular approaches. So I talk about neoliberalism in my book, and neoliberalism really just very simply means that the state is no longer the main provider. So the idea is that you have a different set of providers, including the private sector, that provide. I'm not talking about Myanmar here, but generally neoliberalism means that the state isn't the provider, but the state becomes the regulator for a market where things can be provided by different providers who in certainty do it for money, do it for profit, so on and so forth. So development partners come in with that mindset, thinking that and Myanmar is a state-provided education system, very, very strongly so. And although schools, there are now private schools, that's mainly in Yangon and Mandalay, spreading to other larger cities as well. But there's no way a kind of a market approach to education. So the the mindset of some development partners wanting to see this develop in Myanmar, and the mindset of the Ministry of Education and the Myanmar tradition of offering state education sort of were at odds with each other, and that was quite difficult. And the need that the CSR actually unraveled or uncovered for everyone was the need for greater social justice across different sectors of Myanmar society. So I'm sorry, this is a very long answer, very complicated answer, but the fact is that I don't believe that the development partners saw the need for a socially just or social justice driven reform. They saw the need for a neoliberal reform, whereas what was really required was making sure that you have greater equity with regard to ethnic groups in particular, but also gender, just generally the rural-urban divide being massive, the divide between states and regions being massive, and that being very well known through the CSR, but not being addressed because the priorities of the development partners, which were largely driving what the ministry was able to do. And so you had these various tensions. So one of the things I kept on saying is that the NLD had promised social justice, but actually the reforms that they were offering were not going to achieve social justice. They were going to reform the system. They were going to provide better education, but not necessarily better education for those who were less fortunate in society.
Yeah, you did mention in your book that the NLD's 2015 election manifesto was a breath of fresh air, and that social justice, though not explicitly mentioned in the manifesto, kind of permeates the whole thing. So in the NLD's term, 2015 to 2020, was it purely this kind of bureaucratic limitation talking about the ministry, or were there also political challenges and limitations to what could be reformed, what was aimed at reforming, and what happened?
So with regard to the ministry normally does what it's told. And the problem the ministry faced is that it was being told certain things by the government and certain things by the development partners, and the development partners were largely those which were coming in with the large amounts of money. And so there were big tensions there. But the ministry in itself didn't have political position. So it wouldn't have said we have a neoliberal position or a social justice position. They were just scrambling to try and do things to the best of their ability. That, coupled with the fact that within the ministry, you know this as well as I do, Myanmar society is very hierarchical and the buck always stops with the top person. And in the end, you'll have director generals having to take decisions on minor issues simply because no one below them is able to take that decision and to take responsibility for it because it could cost them their job. So the ministry in many ways should be exonerated from any responsibility. They really, I've spent many hours with different people from different departments in the ministry, and they have always done their absolute best in order to try and provide education for Myanmar society. And I would argue they probably did that under the SPDC as well. But with regard to the NLD, I think actually the hierarchical structure and the command and control tradition that we have in Myanmar really made the kind of reforms that the NLD had promised impossible. Ultimately speaking, in the NLD, the buck stops with Aung San Suu Kyi, and she would have to take the decision on absolutely everything. I mean, there were discussions about, for example, opening up higher education to private providers. Not that that is a solution to anything at all, in my view, but the fact is that the decision to do it or not to do it went right up to her and rested with her. The same thing with regard to mother tongue based education, i.e. being able to not only teach an ethnic language in a school in an ethnic area, but actually use it as a medium of instruction. Aung San Suu Kyi herself took the decision that that was not a good idea to take that forward, which is actually against good practice and has been, something which has been part of education reforms across Southeast Asia in many countries where there are at least as many languages as Myanmar. So in many ways, there were political impediments to delivering the promises, and not only in education, but across the board, that the NLD had taken. And I would also argue that the NLD was simply focused on one thing, which is changing the constitution. And everything else would come later. And in part, the fact that the peace process totally unraveled and became quite a mess compared to the previous administration, where although it was extremely protracted and every word was turned over 5 times, at least there were regular meetings, there was some progress seen, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And in the end, at some particular point in time, we did reach some form of open channels and communication. And while by no means was it a nationwide ceasefire agreement, at least the country had come an incredibly long way from where it was prior to 2010. And I would argue that the NLD just had very particular priorities, which was changing the constitution, making sure that it would be able to stay in power in a different format, the format that was not on offer. And that was more important than the economy or education or health or the peace process. The NLD was also supremely unlucky with regard to the Rohingya crisis. And the fact that with that and the stand that they chose to take, or the stand that Aung San Suu Kyi chose to take, meant that development partners became more reluctant to work with the NLD, in part because governments back home, be it the US or the UK or any of the European governments, would say, there's a genocide case going on at the International Court of Justice, and Aung San Suu Kyi is saying that we did nothing wrong. All these things impacted, and then obviously you have COVID. So between the Rohingya crisis, COVID, and then the coup, the NLD certainly has not been lucky. But I would still argue that they hold a lot of responsibility in that their priorities were not the ones that they put in the manifesto, and that they work towards those priorities. And the biggest failure is not education. The biggest failure is the peace process.
Okay, great. How about now we pull it back and then we go forward into the nitty-gritty of education in Myanmar a little bit more. You've mentioned 2 major components in your book that get brought up time and time again. That is gender and ethnicity. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how these 2 factors affect education in Myanmar, maybe talking about gender in relation to teaching and ethnicity in relation to learning.
So with regards to gender, I mean, Myanmar has more female teachers. I mean, teaching is anyway a very female profession right across the world. But in Myanmar, it is mainly women who teach. And actually, that's not my work has not focused on gender. In fact, I'm not a gender specialist at all. But one of my students a few years ago went and did a master's degree dissertation where she actually spent a lot of time with a group of female teachers, asking them about their lives and why they'd become teachers and how what their choices had meant, and if they were empowered by being teachers. And the interesting thing was that these women were all empowered, quote unquote, but felt, and also at the same time that they were empowered, very repressed by society, because they felt they couldn't marry, they felt they couldn't wear what they wanted to do, they were expected to be role models right from the moment that they got up and got on a bus. One of them, I remember in that transcript that I read, who actually said, I can't even wear a pair of jeans to go on the bus on the weekend because the parents of my students will see me and they will criticize me for it. A lot of these women, and that goes for university female teachers as well, hold a revered position in society because people will look up to them. Sayama, they are the ones who take care of the children. In fact, in Myanmar, you have a lot less parental involvement in government schools, partly because you entrust your children to the teachers. You trust the teacher to take care of them as if they were their own. It's almost like these women are supposed to take care of everyone else's children without having their own children. And because of the way that the school system and the university system both are structured, is these teachers are sent to schools in various areas, irrespective of where their families are. They are unable to have any kind of agency with regards to their own lives. If they get married, it'll mean separation from their husbands and their families. And if they choose to leave, then ultimately speaking, it's very difficult for them to work in any other sector. So despite the reverence that is offered, these women, and they're very poorly paid. That's the other thing. That's one of the reasons we don't find men in this profession. The interesting thing is also that when men enter the teaching profession, they're the ones who then quite quickly graduate up to being secondary school teachers, and then from there on even go into work as township education officers, or even in the state education office, those people are all male. None of them are female, or virtually none of them are female. Women are the broad workforce. They're the ones who suffer most with regards to what society expects them to do. But none of this is actually seen as politically important. So there were women teachers, female teachers, who said that they did not feel that their voices were being heard with regard to change. And although the reforms have now offered different pathways for primary school teachers and secondary school teachers, I bet you that ultimately speaking, the people who will be at township education officers and state education officers will always tend to be more male and less female, whereas those who are in the primary schools and in the lower levels of the secondary school will always be female. So there are big social justice issues with that. With regard to your other question of ethnicity, so as we all know, Myanmar is made up of a majority Burma, 60+% Burma, and then 40 plus minus different ethnic groups. And there is the dual disadvantage of language, especially in areas where the ethnic language is used within the family. If you're living in Mon State or Karen State or Kachin State or Shan State, if you're living in those areas where the ethnic language is used daily, as opposed to living in Yangon and being Karen and speaking Burmese, and then entering a school without being able to understand the teacher, because teachers are majority Burma, and then disadvantage continuing to the point that either dropping out of school, even if you make it to matriculation, never having the required grades, to forget university, to even be able to get into an education college. Which means that you, again, don't get any ethnic teachers, because if you don't make the cut to get into an education college, ultimately speaking, you don't have an ethnic teacher. If you don't have ethnic teachers who are able to explain things to children who have that language barrier and who are discriminated against because they are of a different ethnicity, then that becomes a vicious circle. So one of the things I look at in the book is an ethnic education college, which was set up by the PAO, which I thought was an absolutely fabulous idea. And I went there shortly after. I went there a few times, but shortly after it had been set up. And it was run by a PAO teacher who had worked in the state education system. And she and the committee had basically negotiated with the state education office in Taunji that the teachers from the education college in Taunji would actually go and teach in their free time or in the evenings or on weekends in the ethnic education college. And they would admit those students to the ethnic education college, the ones that had not been accepted to the Taunji education college. And they would make sure that those students would receive exactly the same training in addition to being able to use their languages. And so this was actually a collaboration between an ethnic civil society organization and the state education office. This had not happened before. This was unbelievable. And the state education office actually then offered to place those graduates from the education college in government schools, seeing the value, partly because they didn't have enough teachers, but seeing the value of ethnic teachers. But then what happened is, because there was no understanding about the linguistic issue, those teachers were not placed in schools where they spoke the language. They were placed in schools in ethnic areas, but not necessarily where they spoke the language. And that's sort of defeating the original purpose of this college, because the idea was to place PAO teachers in PAO areas and Shan teachers in Shan areas. And then they also had some Mon and Karen and some others, and Kia and other ethnic groups. So that those teachers would go back to where they came from and teach in those schools, so that students would be able to get better grades, stay in school, and then go. So this aspect is partly due to the lack of recognition of the discrimination and the problems that different ethnic groups face. And one can argue that in Yangon and Mandalay, which are very multi-ethnic and people have mixed marriages and mixed children, these kind of discriminations have sort of fallen by the wayside. But in ethnic states, in areas where the ethnic language is spoken, those discriminations are still very present. I spent some time in Eastern Shan State, for example, with smaller groups, Bisu and Akar and so on and so forth. And they all find this dual disadvantage of language and ethnicity very, very difficult to overcome. And none of that ever makes it into any of the political manifestos of any party, apart from perhaps some of the ethnic parties, but even the ethnic parties don't necessarily look at education as a primary thing. They're more concerned with issues of agriculture and jobs and the peace process. So if you look at any of the ethnic parties, those were their manifestos in the elections. Some of the larger ethnic groups who have ethnic armed groups or ethnic armed organizations representing them or fighting for their cause, many of these ethnic armed organizations have set up parallel school systems. Some of these are quite large. I mean, there's an estimate that over 100,000 children go to ethnic armed group organization schools. And these schools fall into different categories. So this is research that I have done, and I've done a lot of it with Ashley South, but not all of it with Ashley South, in Mon, Karen, and Kachin. And more recently, I've done some work on this in Shan. And what's very interesting is that these schools fall into a continuum. So some tend to teach in the ethnic language, but teach the Myanmar government curriculum. And then at the other end of the spectrum, they teach in the ethnic language, but they teach a totally different curriculum. And that largely depends on where they stand with regards to the peace and conflict situation with the Myanmar government and the Tatmadaw. So you can't expect a group that's being bombed to particularly want to use the Myanmar government curriculum. And that's, for example, Kachin. So in Kachin, we have a situation where for many decades, the Kachin Independence Organization and its education department and the schools used the Myanmar government curriculum in translation mainly in Jingpo, because that's one of the Kachin languages, and that's considered the lead Kachin language, although when you speak to any of the smaller Kachin groups, they vehemently disagree with that. But anyway, in one particular Kachin language, that particular curriculum was being taught, and children going to those schools were able to study the Myanmar curriculum with all its faults and defects, and then transfer to government schools in order to be able to take a matriculation exam, because many of these ethnic schools are primarily primary and middle schools, but not high schools. So transfer to a government high school and then take the matriculation exam and then be able to go on to Myanmar University. Same system in Mon state, where that's the oldest system out of all, where the Mon language is taught and Mon history is taught, but otherwise the Myanmar government curriculum is taught in Mon and transferring slowly over to Burmese, and then the children can go on to university. What happened in Kachin is in 2011, we had a resumption of the conflict. And as I said, when you are being bombed, you don't particularly want to use the curriculum of the bombers for your children. And this was part of the impetus to start developing a Kachin-based curriculum. And Kachin is very interesting because obviously KIO and KIA are very rich organizations compared to, for example, some of the other armed groups, partly because of where they're located in terms of the jade trade, the teak trade, China, but also they're a very big organization, and with the writing of a Kachin curriculum, they did not see that in itself as just a means to get their children into Myanmar higher education. In fact, that becomes impossible. If you have a separate curriculum, your children cannot take the matriculation exam, cannot enter universities. So in Kachin, they started building their own colleges. So actually, Kachin is one of the few ethnic groups in Myanmar, or the only ethnic group, which has a reasonably large post-school, I wouldn't call it a higher education system. They have two colleges. One liberal arts college and one sort of, I'm not quite sure how to classify that college. And then they have a number of post-school sort of diploma level. They've got a nursing college, they've got an education college, they've got an agricultural college, and they've got a law college. So actually, children graduating through the Kachin system are able, not everyone, but some of them are able to continue into Kachin higher education. That is quite interesting because it shows that Kachin is sort of veering away from the Myanmar education system, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the Mon system, there is an expectation, there is no option to study in a Mon higher education that doesn't exist. They've got various teacher training programs for their own school teachers, but apart from that, you just integrate into normally Mon University, or any of the other universities in Myanmar. So you've got that sort of those two extremes. And the reason that ethnic groups Kachin and Mon being the largest, but Karen also having a very big system, and Shan developing, Shan especially RCSS schools were increasing at the time when I was doing the research. And Kia also has a budding sort of separate system. The reason that they do that is because they feel that that's the only way that the children from ethnic groups can get a good education, can get the equivalent of what Burmese or Burma children can get in a Myanmar government school. So that's also driven by a social justice ideal. But the interesting thing about this now is that these schools are continuing. They actually continued through COVID, because most of these schools were located in areas where there were low incidences of COVID or where there were high incidences of vaccination. Kachin, for example, Kachin vaccinated extremely quickly compared to the rest of the country. They're getting the vaccines from China. And that means that schools in ethnic areas were able to continue. Those parallel systems were able to continue, and they don't have the learning gap that we've got throughout the Myanmar government system, where there's over a year of learning gap, both at school level and at university level, which is absolutely tragic.
Right, and their insularity and being at the rear headquarters kind of insulates them from the wider turmoil. Speaking of turmoil and the coup, which we've touched on several times, let's get into it. The coup. What does the coup mean for education reform in Myanmar? Are there still international organisations working with the SAC or the NUG? Is this the end of education reform or just a pause?
I'm hoping the coup means that the pause button has been struck rather than the end button, but I think only time will tell. I think that even if it's the pause button, whatever comes once the dust has settled will be quite different from what we had before. But yes, we are basically dealing with two different entities here. And with regard to the development partners, they have, many people left during COVID, but did not come back after the coup, or left at the time of the coup if they had come back, and money has been paused. So anything which was being financed by, take your pick, USAID, World Bank, UNICEF, and so on and so forth. Actually, take UNICEF out of this equation. UNICEF's a bit different. Any of these programs have been paused and stopped for the moment. JICA is a bit different. So the Japanese aid organization operates quite differently. They were in touch throughout the military junta years, SLORC, SPDC, and then very, very active post Thein Sein and continuing on with the NLD. They have always maintained that their support is to the Myanmar people rather than to the Myanmar government. And as a result, they are still there. They are not, my understanding, speaking to colleagues in JICA, is that the Japanese government is allowing programs that have been agreed and financed to continue, but anything new would have to be discussed. But I do not see JICA pulling out. UNICEF, obviously, being there for the protection of the children, still is operating in a limited way. It always has operated in Myanmar under different forms of government. But again, rather than being part of these absolutely massive reforms where the entire sector was being changed, this is much more about sort of just keeping the lights on in schools, making sure that teachers have what they need and that there's some form of support there. So UN organizations and JICA operate on a slightly different scale. I do believe that the SAC, when they announce the elections, at that particular point in time, they will want to re-engage with civil society. They will want to re-engage with any willing development partner. There might be very few. It might only be JICA and the UN organizations, but they will want to put forward an image of continuing reform. Those reforms would obviously look quite different because in the absence of external money, in the absence of development partners, in the absence of the main protagonists, teachers and academics, students and parents, the entire picture looks very, very different. But I don't think this is the end of reform. I just think that it's going to, the image that we see is going to look quite different.
Just to finish off, I was really happy reading your book that there was a decent section there on Myanmar Egress. And I wanted to ask you just to speak briefly about Myanmar Egress. What was its role in broader reforms in fostering civil society and in, I guess, educational reform in Myanmar? Because it doesn't really get talked about that often, Myanmar Egress, and you are a very good person to talk about it on this podcast.
So Myanmar Egress came into being in 2006, And I was extremely fortunate that I was there when it came into being. I knew the boys separately, variously, through my work in Myanmar that I'd started in 2005. And the idea that Myanmar Egress propagated was there won't be change in Myanmar through revolution. There can only be change if we work within the limits that are imposed upon us by the government of the day. But we can try and push those limits. And by taking certain risks, push those limits up to a certain degree, and then see what will be accepted by the government and what's not accepted, then give them a bit more time, but also by educating the middle classes as to what it meant to go into a changed Myanmar, a more participatory Myanmar. So Myanmar Egress had its fingers in all sorts of pots. It started very, very simply as an organization that was going to provide basic education to the generation that had missed out on university education about simple things about what is a constitution, what does it mean to vote, what does it mean to pay taxes, what should a government do? Simple questions that students would have, or young people would never have been able to ask, partly because they weren't able to go to university, partly because they'd lived under a military dictatorship for so long, but very clearly disavowing any kind of revolution, going onto the streets and trying to overthrow the regime, simply saying that that's not going to work. The organization expanded massively. It almost became like a mini higher education institution with various courses of various lengths. You could take a course for a year, you could take a course for 3 months. Different aid organizations, in particular German political foundations, were funding this. There was also summer courses, which I was teaching on. Then Myanmar Egress got involved in helping with Cyclone Nargis, so supporting other civil society organizations to network with each other in order to bring relief, because at the time of Cyclone Nargis, aid organizations were not allowed into the Delta, but aid organizations were allowed to give relief goods to Myanmar civil society organizations going out there. So that was part of Myanmar Egress's expansion of its mandate. Then there was a research center that was put up in order to, and we had actually 2 different research centers, some doing quantitative work, partly in support for the World Bank projects. Although I was training people in qualitative work in order to be able to write policy briefs. Those policy briefs were put up right to the top of the SPDC in trying to argue for change with regard to, what is the context, what does the country need, what is a needs assessment, what do people want, what will people accept. Then they got involved in building up political parties and educating potential MPs in what it meant to stand as a politician, because the country never had since 1962, it'd been ruled by the military. There'd never been any kind of politics outside of the NLD, and the NLD was run in a very particular way. So this was open to anyone who wanted to look at the country in a different way. So Myanmar Egress took a lot of risks, was also extremely well connected at all levels. We shouldn't deny that. They were able to, through their connections, make sure that the regime was informed of what they would be doing, so that there was least possible risks to the students, to the teachers, to the people who were accessing Myanmar Egress. They posed themselves as an organization for change, but without wanting to threaten the military regime. And in many ways, so I've written quite a lot about Myanmar Egress in my previous book, the 2016 book, which was published by Hearst, because that was the origins of, in my view, without Myanmar Egress, the reforms that we had from 2010 to 2020 would never have happened. Without Myanmar Egress, the president and sane government would not have accepted Aung San Suu Kyi's return to politics. And we would not have had the 2015 elections, which were free and fair and accepted, and the transfer of power in the way that we had it. I think they are due a vote of thanks by a lot of people for what they contributed to that process. This is what I believe personally. But that they were also an organization that then sort of was copied and replicated by many other civil society organizations. Myanmar suddenly exploded with other civil society organizations, many even run by Myanmar Egress graduates. And that's fantastic. It was not only about one. So this one organization obviously declined and fell apart. Partly Dr. Nguyen Mal died, and then obviously not on greatest terms with the NLD. So people went home and went and did their own things. But the Myanmar Egress graduates continued. So you have research organizations, civil society organizations, social entrepreneurship organizations, all of those things that had been learned by the alumni of Myanmar Egress, taken out. And across the country, wherever I travel, I always came across some Myanmar Egress alumni who say, oh, yes, of course, yeah, we were there in whatever year taking that course. And I believe this is actually an organization like Myanmar Egress is what will be needed again, not Myanmar Egress per se, but an organization with the same kind of understanding.
Yeah, well, I mean, given all that and given what's going on in the country right now, what do you think is going through alumni's, in particular, the alumni's minds? You had this huge, diverse group of people going through the Myanmar Egress organization. You had NLD family kids, you had Tamador kids, you had people who were, stuck between married to special branch or whatever it may be. And they all managed to work and learn together in this environment of huge political polarization and massive trauma with the hope that they were going to get something better. And now these same people are either stuck at home, just shutting up, running down their savings as COVID-19 goes unchecked by public health authorities. The streets aren't safe. The hundreds of Myanmar Egress graduates who went into CSOs have all lost their jobs as civil society has collapsed in the wake of military subjugation. And then others have picked up guns and gone to the jungle. They've completely disillusioned, completely broken. I mean, what are these graduates, these change makers, hopeful change makers, meant to think? What should they be thinking now?
I don't know what anyone should be thinking, frankly. I personally believe that we have to wait for the dust to settle. I've said this a number of times, to understand what the SAC will do to take the country forward. And this might take a while. The last time it took 15, 20 years. Hopefully this time it won't take that long. Hopefully in a few months or a couple of years, we will know what the pathway is that they're offering. And then those who feel able to put the country first, put the Myanmar people first, will have to put their disgust aside and start working towards the social causes, the economic causes, the health, the education causes, to start bringing about change. That is what I believe is going to be the way forward. Ultimately speaking, Buddhism teaches us one thing, which is to start again and to start again and to start again. So you start again, you fail, you start again, you fail, you start again, you fail. I think that's the only way forward. I can't speak about what anyone who was or is was Myanmar Egress, what their views are on the coup. I don't know. I haven't spoken to anyone since the coup, in part because I don't want to endanger anyone. I'm in touch with some of my friends on social media, on Signal and on Telegram and so on, just to make sure that everyone's all right. I've lost friends to COVID. But in terms of talking about change, that is only something that can be taken up. That mantle can only be taken up by Myanmar young people within the country with their vision of change. And once they start moving, then a lot of people, not only me, but a lot of people, international people, will come and support them simply because, you just have to start again.
Okay, that's well put. Let's move on to the end of the podcast, the recommendations. So now you can please give our listeners a recommendation. Anything to do with Myanmar is okay. Doesn't have to be a scholarly book. It can be a dish, or it can be something that made you fall in love with the country, or anything like that. What do you have for our audience before we wrap up, Marie? A recommendation about Myanmar?
I think two things, but Tant Mint U's book, River of Lost Footsteps, is one that I recommend to all of my students. It's the history of Myanmar as bedside reading. And I mean, he writes in such an absolutely amazing way, even about history, which is 1,000 years old. He just really knows how to portray the country in such a vivid, real way. So that definitely. And for any of you who haven't had mohinga, go and find your local Myanmar restaurant and have it for breakfast. Please don't have it for lunch or for dinner. have the traditional Myanmar breakfast. I really miss mohinga. Those who know me will know that I don't eat meat or chicken, but I eat fish. And so I'm so grateful that one of the staples of Myanmar food is actually based on fish. So yes, go and eat mohinga and read your River of Lost Footsteps whilst you're doing so.
Great recommendation. And what an incredible dish mohinga is. It is based in fish, but people throw everything in it, right? It's the mohinga. It's like all the stuff. So much more than fish.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much for giving so much of your time to the podcast for this conversation about your book, which, again, is called Myanmar's Education Reforms, A Pathway to Social Justice, ? Published in 2020 by UCL Press. And again, it is free to access online at the UCL Press website. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you for having me.